And hello, everyone. We are live for SPSM Chat 2.0 Reboot. By the way, you probably didn't know that this will be our last broadcast for the summer. We're probably going to do some special, maybe one or two through July and August, but not sure about that. It will see what happens. I watch the news during the summer. That's, I think, what I'll be doing. Be aware, though, that the old guard, as April Foreman refers to it, the old guard, will be doing some specials. I think they're going to be using Twitch and or Facebook Live, but we'll make sure that we post it out of SPSM so you can see it back and forth. So my name is Anne Marie Matulis. It hasn't changed in 6 months that I know of. And let's see, I wear too many hats. I'm here as the host for SPSM Chat 2.0. I am the chairperson of the American Association of Suicidology's Impacted Family and Friends Committee, and we're going to be seeing a lot of stuff about that coming up in the next couple of weeks. But here in Massachusetts, I have responsibilities too, both in a county format and across the state. And I am the director for the Bristol County Regional Coalition for Suicide Prevention. We're blessed that we have 10 regional coalitions across the Commonwealth. And what I love about it is we're all autonomous. It's not cookie cutter. You know, everybody does things a little differently, focuses on some different areas of suicide prevention based on the needs of their local community. And it's different. So I'm here in a somewhat rural city atmosphere. Bristol County has 500,000 people, 20 cities and towns. But if you go out to the Berkshires, you know, you're talking about extreme rural atmosphere. So that what we do here in Bristol would not necessarily apply to the Berkshires. So that's kind of a cool thing that I like to do. I also have the privilege of being the TA for two of the grants that the state operates under, and one is operates with, and that's the Garrett Lee Smith State and Tribal Grant for Youth Suicide Prevention. And our newest, we just finished our first year working with it, is problem gambling and suicide. That has been an eye-opener and education, and wow, there's so much to learn there. So we have our two guests tonight, and our topic is suicide, mental and emotional wellness, and the faith-based community. And in the underscore to that is, so how can the faith-based community become champions for suicide prevention? We had Judge Alerna Wren on, and we had Vic Armstrong on a few weeks ago. We were talking about, Judge Wren had been on twice, and we talked about how can judges become champions for suicide prevention and mental wellness. And of course, Victor, with communities of color, with people imprisoned and incarcerated, and so that now we're going to add this layer to it. And I look at this as a tapestry that I happen to feel, and you can challenge me if you want, do it carefully, that I think we've missed the boat for the last very long time, that we are still too siloed, we're still too territorial, and we've missed the fact that why are people continuing to die by suicide? Because we're only we do this narrow tunnel vision. We'll take care of this. In the meantime, maybe it's someone who's in recovery from substance abuse and trips and falls into the pitfall of problem gambling, you know, or maybe there's domestic violence in the background, or maybe there's an eating disorder there. And I think it's long past time that we start weaving that tapestry together, and come to a summit, an intersection that brings it all together, and we don't keep leaving people out. And that includes the LGBTQ community. It includes people of color, anybody who's marginalized, like me, family of impacted family and friends. So that was my blurb for tonight. Marsh, introduce yourself. People should know you. Marshall. Are you there? Can't hear you. All right, Robert, jump.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it looks like maybe Marshall's freezing a bit there. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens with Marshall.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. So glad to be here. My name is Robert Vore. I am a mental health counselor in the Atlanta area.
Yeah, we can now. Hang on. Go ahead, Robert.
Here.
Yeah. No, I don't. He looks good though. He looks good.
Yes, he looks really good.
Yeah, he looks great. Yeah, so I'm a counselor here in the Atlanta area. I work primarily with adolescents and young adults, so kind of 12 to 30-ish. That range is just the area that I'm passionate about. Before that, worked in different types of ministries, things like that. And so, one of the areas that I'm really passionate about coming out of that is helping faith leaders, ministry leaders know how to better engage with mental health in general, obviously, particularly suicide prevention. But so I do some trainings in those areas as well, both kind of general mental health trainings, but also I'm a QPR instructor. So I do suicide prevention trainings for, campus ministry staffs or youth volunteers, church staffs, things along those lines. And that I timed it perfectly, I think, because looks like Marshall is good to go.
Good to go, Marsh. Let us know who you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Awesome.
Nice.
All right. Awesome. So my name is Marshall Taylor. I'm a graduate of Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia, just north of Richmond, small liberal arts college. I'm currently a student at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, not the big theological school up in New York that many have confused me for going to. But I've been doing SPSM since my senior year of high school.
Yeah, I saw that and I went, wow.
Yeah, I've been doing this a long time. My first conference, AS conference, was supposed to be Chicago, ended up being Phoenix.
Okay.
So I've been doing this for a while, but my faith-based stuff has been slowly seeping in. As a religious studies major, this is what I actually, this topic tonight is kind of what I wrote my capstone paper on, 17 pages and a 10-minute presentation. So
cool.
Put a lot of work into this. A whole
so
semester.
You're good. You don't need us. We're just gonna
we're
just
gonna sit back
and grab a snack.
you can just go through your whole capstone and we'll just sit.
Yeah, I'm sure my advisor would disagree with you on that one.
I doubt it. You're moving forward, so that means it's fine. But I do understand that tension. A dear friend of mine just defended her doctorate Friday, and I knew it would be a cakewalk for her, but she had that. What am I going to say? I said, just speak from the heart. You've got this. Don't worry about it. And so she does. I told her I was also never calling her doctor. So, well, we're both Dorchester girls from Boston, and I have an Irish Scottish background. She's all Irish. And it was like, I'm not calling you doctor. It's just not going to happen. Maybe once in public, but I'm not going to do that. All right. Awesome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come off screen. I can hear you. So I will interrupt or gently, lovingly, politely interrupt if there's a question coming off. But I'm going to jump on the Twitter chat because you don't need me to micromanage this. And I say that to all the guests. It's like, you don't need me to just move you forward. I want the two of you, Robert, I want you to start with the things that you thought about coming on tonight.
Yeah.
Then toss it over to Marsh. And then the two of you, until I run in and say, okay, stop and pause, just keep that going back and forth. You don't need me for this conversation. Okay?
Yeah.
You guys golden with that?
Yeah, why not?
All right. See how easy I made this? All right, Robert, you're up.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what's awesome is going to be kind of having this conversation, right? Because Marshall, you're coming from obviously a suicide prevention background, but also you're a faith leader, right? You mentioned you preached this morning, right? So you're very much in that world. I am a little bit in that world, but more so now in the clinical world, in kind of the counseling world, obviously. And so I think what's interesting is, she mentioned in that opening there that we're too siloed, right? And I often think, if we're all in the business of offering hope and healing, then why is it that we seem to not be able to kind of build these bridges? And I know there's plenty of people that are working in that area. How do we build these bridges? But, in the interest of kind of conversation, we were just talking a little bit before we started, but Marshall, as a faith leader, and obviously you're more plugged in to a lot of this than others, but so you go to school with other religious studies majors, things like that. But what does it take so if we said, hey, we have all these faith leaders, how do we get them involved in this, right? Like what's the gap there? I'm interested, kind of from your perspective, what what do we do there? How do we help build that bridge from both sides, but particularly from this side?
I mean, I think one of the things that it kind of falls clinical and psychology and that side coming to the faith side kind of falls flat on is completely misunderstanding religious texts, completely misunderstanding doctrine, completely misunderstanding the history. And that's why I wrote my paper on both a biblical studies interpretation of suicide and a church history interpretation, just because I think it's important that we, if you're going into this as a suicide prevention advocate, as a suicidologist, as a psychiatrist, whatever you're going into it as, you have to know the background. If you don't know the background, you're not going to get to these people. You go to, someone who's Catholic, you're going to have this interpretation. If you go to someone who's, from the Southern Baptist Convention, you're going to get this interpretation. And I think it's really important that we understand that Christianity is compartmentalized. Some ways in a good way, some ways in a bad way. That's its own. That's its own. We could write a whole podcast on that. But I think it's the fact that not many people understand how to come at it for a faith-based side of things. They don't know, what does the Bible say about suicide? A lot of psychologists, suicidologists have no clue. So, that's kind of where I come from on this. I mean, I have the late great Jim Clemens to thank for a lot of what I know, because his book, What Does the Bible Say About Suicide, and his other book, Sermons on Suicide, have both been so incredibly helpful in helping me go, oh, this is how I have to compartmentalize it for suicidology to understand what I'm talking about. I think we were talking about this earlier, we're both super technical in our, we both think we're on both really high planes, and neither of us we're missing each other. We're passing each other. So.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I guess my so I also host a podcast, so my kind of facilitating is coming out instead of potentially being a guest. But no, I think that's so interesting, talking about kind of the misunderstanding coming that direction, right? Because part of what I think is interesting to me is coming from going into a church and doing some of these suicide prevention trainings or things like that. There does tend to be the suicide prevention community has a lot of theories, and this theory, why things are the way they are, how risk factors, warning signs, how we conceptualize a lot of those, even psychology and things like that in general. And so it makes, similar to how you're kind of talking about theology as how do we understand all this, it makes kind of the mental health world, I think, for faith leaders who have kind of no interaction with that other than sitting across from people, it is kind of this, I picture this weird, mysterious, foggy forest of well, I know that that's a problem, but the whole, to understand all of it is really confusing. And if people are coming in with these theories and things like that, and really usually what they're saying is, hey, if someone comes to me and says, hey, this is happening, how do I help? What do I do right there? Right. I don't need a huge theory. I don't need. And so it sounds like we are kind of missing it from both sides, as you're talking about. How do we understand each other better? How do we bring it down maybe a couple levels so that both sides are having the same conversation?
Right. I know I'm going to try and do some of capstone stuff at next AAS. And I know I'm going to have to bring it down a couple pegs on the theology, just because that's going to go over so many people's heads. As a religious studies major, everybody that I presented it to was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But no one in a room full of suicidologists is going to understand the complexities of Augustine. That's just not how it works. Yeah. So, I think bringing everything down to its base level and building it up, I think that's what's really, really important.
Yeah, no, that's so good. Sometimes I think when I start doing writing trainings or things like that, I can tell maybe I'm getting a little in the weeds, and I have this little sticky note, and it says it says simple, but then it says, does this help? Right. And so I think I always try to bring it back to that in terms of, okay, if I'm getting too much into, the various theories of suicidology, right? There's the Joiner theory, there's the 3-step, right? So if we get into all these, maybe that's helpful if somebody says, okay, but how do people end up there? But for the most part, what people are saying is, how do I help somebody who's in crisis? Or maybe how do we help people from getting into a suicidal crisis, which maybe then we bust out some theories.
Right.
But even then, even like the theological jargon, similar to the psychological jargon, right? If there's, sometimes I read papers, like, published journals, and I think I have to click back a couple links to figure out what's happening here. So if I'm, a youth pastor or a faith leader who's putting on events every week and things like that, and in between I have to do this and write sermons or go visit someone, I don't have time to kind of figure out all that and maybe attend like a long training, right? So how do we make it accessible in a variety of ways to faith communities so that we can rope them into helping?
Definitely. I think that's, and I think I agree with you about getting into the weeds. Just preach it. Like you said, I preached this morning and I was getting into the weeds and I was like, oh, wow, this is real jargony. And the average age of this congregation is like 75. They don't care about the Greek and the Hebrew. They don't care.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's a lot like that in mental health and suicide prevention is we both, to build the bridges, we have to kind of like build from the bottom up, not from top down.
No, that's good. I'm going to take a note on that.
Go for it.
Take your notes.
That's awesome. So let me ask you, what's the first, like, build from the bottom up instead of the top down, right? So where do we start? Because I think there's some chunks of, so I conceptualize faith communities in regards to mental health in kind of 3 chunks. There's one chunk that says, hey, mental health doesn't exist. We're just, everything's spiritual. And so we say, okay, maybe they're not going to listen to us, or at least maybe we're not writing them off, but that's one thing. And then all the way on the other side, there's people who are doing really good, but there's this huge middle chunk that says, we know this is a problem. We just don't know where to start even to help. If we're building from the bottom up, if I'm a suicide prevention person, how do we start? Where's the bottom plank,
Can you guys hear me? I want to make sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, make sure. Just my computer did some weird things. All right. So, I think
Welcome to my world.
You, from a Christian background. Yeah, exactly. From a Christian background, and that's where I'm attacking this from for the most part, is you have to start at scripture, because that's where almost every faith community is going to put its base level. It's like, all right, give me scriptural text to back your argument. And in a lot of systems of Christianity, if you don't have that, you're not going to get anywhere further. If you don't have that scriptural background, they're not going to care. So I'm going to try not to get too theological, like we were talking about, too biblical academic on you. But there are 7 suicides in the Bible, and the main point is that none of them are condemned in Scripture. None of them are condemned for how they die. Saul is buried with honor with his family. Samson is considered a war hero for his suicide. We have the obvious, infamous problem of Judas, betrayer of Jesus. So, and he is not condemned for how he dies. He's considered condemned for what he did before he died. But then the next peg, I guess, all right, you've got that scriptural backing of, all right, you've got 7 suicides in Scripture. You also have suicide attempts that are stopped. In Acts 16, you have the Philippian jailer that Paul infamously, at least in suicide prevention from a faith-based perspective, we use the quote, do not harm yourself, for we are all here. The jailer thought everybody had escaped. He was going to kill himself because he had failed at his job. And Paul and all the rest of the prisoners said, do not harm yourself, for we are all here. So that one has always been something I've hung on to. And then your next building block is going to be doctrine. If it's a religious community outside of, like, I'd say non-denominational churches, you're going to have a doctrine that they build off of. Even non-denominationals have a system of beliefs. And so you have to go back and look at that. You know, in the Catholic Church, there's a Roman Catechism. And the Catechism actually, at Vatican II in 1965, added that someone who dies by suicide via mental anguish is not responsible for their actions. Therefore, it's not sinful, which is a huge step forward from, you know, 1900 years of Catholic thinking, you know. So I think, you know, basically to get at the base level of this is you start your building block at scripture. You build on top of that with doctrine, build on top of that with any history that that denomination or church has. The Christian church has a rough history with suicide, to say the least, as far as its writings and how it's condemned it, Catholic and Protestant. When I was doing my capstone, I came upon a article that John Calvin, the founder of Presbyterianism, people would rather kill themselves than face his jury, you know, to be condemned for, you know, being heretical to the Presbyterian Church. So, you know, the Christian church has a problem with suicide and how it's dealt with it in the past. And I think once you get people to understand that, then the next step is, but we can do better, and here's how. With Safe Talk, with Assist, with this training, that training, understanding the scripture background, understanding the doctrine, understanding the history, and how, you know, if, you know, a lot of what I point to in the church history is, you know, you don't follow everything Augustine said, why you keep me up with suicide as sin notion. That's kind of my fire back to clergy is, you know, you don't respect anything else he said. Why do you respect that? You know? So,
Gentlemen, can I jump in for a moment?
Go for it.
You do.
So you both prompted some thoughts in my head. And Marsh, I understand you're coming from you're talking about the capstone, and this is your area of study, and that is the scripture. But for both of you, what if the person you're working with has come to you for pastoral support, but starts to kick back when they hear very precise description of scripture? Does that make sense? Do I need to reword that?
No, like as in like someone having a problem with you just quoting scripture at them, or
right.
with religion.
Right.
Yeah, I think, and I've dealt with that. You know, I've got many friends who have had suicidal ideation and attempts who are not at all religious. And I think that's where we fall back onto our keeping the theology out of it. I think you kind of, when you know, in pastoral care, there's an approach that, hey, if this person isn't very religious, but I'm just someone they can come to, I put my religion to the side. At least that's how I view pastoral care, is that I kind of compartmentalize and go, okay, I have my religion. This person has, let's say, they're of a different faith. Let's say, you know, they're Buddhist. All right. One, you got to know your stuff. But two, just put it to the side and talk human to human. Something that comes to mind when I think about that is how the Sunday after 9/11, churches across the country were packed to the brim.
Yep.
And everybody just, I know one priest said that he just put his sermon and his liturgy aside, all of it, you know, and in the Anglican church, it's a big deal. And he just, one person to another, let's talk about this.
And so you lead me right into, and Robert, I'm going to come right over to you, and I should keep saying, I'm sorry to interrupt. No, I'm not. Because I love this conversation. And I'm the one at the table, by the way, who always wants to enforce no crosstalk with this. But I think 9/11 is a tragic but definite example of how we pulled those silos down. We pulled the walls that were barriers down. It didn't matter. People just gravitated to whether it was a mosque or whether it was a Catholic church or whether it was of whatever faith, a Buddhist temple, people just felt the need, which I thought was a profound statement, because we constantly hear the criticism that we have lost our spiritual way, that and I've heard that within suicidology, that we've kind of lost. I'm not sure suicidology had a spiritual path in the beginning, but I think it's getting one by bits and pieces. But Robert, let's talk about that. So, because I am not, I warned you before we started, I'm not the confronting. I'm a firm believer that whatever works for someone, we should celebrate and not criticize and not critique at all. And that contempt prior to investigation of not allowing ourselves to be open. I'm trying to think, it was just on social media and I forget who the quote was, but we need to keep our minds like a parachute. It doesn't work if you don't open it.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to move this over, and then we're going to come back to you for that.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I think, what's interesting, I think going back to kind of how does this help level, right? Because so Marshall is responding to the question that I asked him, which is obviously what I wanted him to do. But, bringing up some good things with theology and doctrine, I think keeping those in mind. But I do want to, push back a little bit in, Marshall and I are friends.
That's okay.
And so we're not, arguing, but in any like training or suicide prevention training or anything like that I've done for church staffs or anything, nobody has ever like asked me to argue theology. Now, granted, they invited me in, so they're at least on board with, okay, this is something to be talked about in the first place, right? So potentially maybe like big conflicting problems of doctrine would be ones that wouldn't have had me come in the first place. But I do think it even if we say, okay, maybe we're not there on finer points of whatever, but we can come back to, you do what you do most likely if you work in some kind of faith community because you want to help people, right? You have some sense of how do we offer hope and how do we offer healing and how do we improve your life? I mean, those are typically somebody that works in some kind of faith community, for the most part, I think we would say, has those things in mind. And so we can come back to that of like, hey, like you were talking about, kind of this shared spirituality of, hey, talking about somebody's pain is something, regardless of, maybe how you would phrase it, right, is some kind of sacred something where somebody is saying, hey, here's the deepest parts of my pain and suffering and the dark parts of my soul. Can you help me? And so I think if we can center the conversation around that, then I think we can enlist a whole bunch of maybe faith communities into this suicide prevention thing where we say, look, you're here to help people, you're here to love people and do it well, or however you want to phrase it. People are hurting and they come to you first, right? I mean, I have I think 4 separate citations here of people who are more likely to turn to a faith leader or a clergy person or whatever than they are to go to a professional. I mean, I work in the mental health field, and if you said, hey, go find a counselor to talk to, I would have to figure out co-pays and insurance and scheduling, and I would have to find the right one. If you said, go find a faith leader to talk to, there's 12 churches or any kind of faith communities within walking distance of my house where somebody would, if you said, will you talk to me? Somebody would say, yeah, come on, sit down. Let's sit over here. And so we have to respect that enough, because I do think there, if we kind of look at historical things, right, there is this tension of like, whose job is this? And I think if we can set aside some of that and say, regardless of whether we think it's a counselor's job or a psychologist's job or a psychiatrist, regardless of that, people are going to faith leaders. So we need to help them help their people, and in terms potentially save lives, or I would say almost undoubtedly save lives if we can equip them a little bit better,
And I agree with the undoubtedly. Marsh, your turn.
Something you said reminded me of this. My father was in a support group for clergy, and the psychologist, he only saw clergy. That was his only clientele, was clergy members of any Christian background. And whenever you started he would ask you to start telling your story, and he would just slowly take his shoes off. And everybody always asks, Bob, why are you taking your shoes off? He said, when Moses saw the burning bush in the desert, in the wild, he took off his shoes because it was sacred ground. You're telling your story. This is sacred ground. And I think that's that kind of ideology of, that's one bridge we can build, is that people's stories, no matter how painful, no matter how heartbreaking, are still, this is sacred space.
Yeah.
It's a sacred time that they are feeling some kind of way, whether they're religious or not. You treat it as if it's, your sanctuary or your mosque or your temple or whatever. You treat it with the same respect. You treat their time and their emotions with the same respect you would treat your religious institutions, time and emotions. And I think that.
No, go ahead, Marsh. Go ahead.
Oh no, and I just think that's a really great way to bridge that gap. Is that this is, no matter how spiritual you are or your client is, that this is kind of there's something sacred about it, right? There's something sacred about the 55 minutes a counselor or a psychiatrist or a psychologist spends with a client, taking notes and two people understanding each other at any moment. I think this is kind of getting into my theology, but two people sitting across from each other sharing a moment, that's just as sacred as anything else, any church or any mosque.
Robin, this leads me right into something that I saw on your podcast site.
Yeah.
I went nosing around.
Yeah.
And Marshall, by the way, that is probably one of the most profound and beautiful statements I have ever heard. And the description and the visual that goes with it is incredible. I'm taking off my shoes because it's sacred ground. And that is so important for people to know that their story is that important and it is sacred. It's their lived experience. So thank you for sharing that. That was, wow, that was awesome. So Robert, you talked about the importance of narrative.
Yeah.
Jump in.
So we did a whole episode on that, but that's something. So I do a lot of like narrative work in my counseling, and a lot of it comes down to kind of what is it that you believe is true about you and about your life and about the way the world works, right? And so I think those things, and you were given and taught those things largely by other people, by important people in your life, by maybe directly they told you, but maybe also they demonstrated it to you. Somebody demonstrated throughout your life that you weren't worth their time, or right, and things like that. And what I see is when we in my counseling room, when we get down to it, we can, if we peel enough layers back, we say, hey, did you realize this is what you're believing to be true about you or about your life or about the world, right? Oh, well, I'm supposed to be a better dad, right? Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, I should be spending more time, whatever. Okay, we get down to, okay, well, dads do this thing and I don't do that, so I'm not good enough, right? And so we can get down to that kind of narrative, and based on obviously the theory of suicide that you ascribe to, but a lot of them, we get into some narratives of, I'm not good enough. I'm causing people pain. I'm not, nobody loves me. I'm worthless. Things like that, right? We get into those, and instead of viewing them as maybe these like, psychological conditions or states, which it's easy to do again if we're in the clinical world, but if we can get to, what's really powerful is having somebody say, hey, did you know that you're believing the sentence, I'm not good enough, I shouldn't be here anymore, or something, if you can get it into a sentence, because that's how people speak, It's like when we talk about cognitive distortions in CBT and things like that, right? That's all fine and good, but when you're sitting across from somebody, you say, hey, did you notice you're assuming that they think the worst about you, right? That's how people speak. And so these narratives of what is it that people are believing about themselves, or, okay, I'm not a good enough Christian, I'm not a good enough practitioner of this faith, that faith, well, then everybody hates me. And, you can get into these narratives. And I just find that people understand that idea, because we all love stories. I mean, even
Yep.
Marshall just referenced people's stories, right? We all love stories. That's why we read and watch TV and watch movies. And so if we can frame things in that light, I find it really helpful in terms of kind of talking with my clients, like, hey, did you realize you were believing these things at the core of all these other things you were believing? Yeah, I don't know if that answered.
Yeah. So then how do you help them make the turnaround?
You know, what I find a lot of times is that people they might not recognize the bottom level narrative of
Okay.
what it is. You know, they might say, well, yeah, I really should be doing this. Oh, I really should be doing this. Oh, well, I'm not doing enough of this. And if you dig kind of underneath that, you say, what should? What do you mean should? There is no should, right?
Yeah.
And they say, well, because good people eat healthily and I don't eat healthily, so I'm not a good person, right? But what they were starting at is, I really should eat better.
Yeah.
And they were carrying around that guilt and shame,
Yeah.
right? But what we can get to is, did you realize what you just said? You said, I don't eat good, so I'm not a good person.
Mm-hmm.
And most people go, oh. And you say, hey, is that the criteria you use for anybody else? And everybody always says, no, of course not. That's a ridiculous criteria. I say,
Yeah.
okay, so
No, good point. I love that.
you know, and
Yep.
And that type of thing, you know. And obviously there's maybe some deeper ones. That's kind of a, you know, first example. But and if they really do say, you know what, I do believe that, then maybe, okay, where do we get that narrative, right? Okay, well, if I'm a good person, that means everybody else around me is, you know, getting hurt, you know, something like that, where we say, okay, if it's something like that and we're really sitting on that, then it might go into, okay, where does that come from? Like, who taught you that? You know, how did you learn that? Well, when I was a kid, you know, I had a friend who, his parents thought I was better than him, and so they punched him, and I watched it. You know, you get into things like that where you say, okay, was that a fair thing to have been taught? Would you teach that to a little kid, you know?
Yep.
And so you get into things like that of challenging some of those narratives, and not saying, hey, that's not true, but saying, do you think this is true? And would you teach this to other people? You know, is this how you're evaluating the rest of the world? And oftentimes there's, you know, oh, you know what? I don't think I would, but I've been carrying that around as gospel truth for 30 years, you know, not knowing that all these other thoughts were stemming from kind of this thing down here.
Marshall.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about people not really understanding, you know, their worth, and in pastoral care and any religious setting of any faith, I think, and I've said this in sermons before, that when we break down religion and faith, when we break down faith itself to its most basic core, it's all about hope. And giving someone something, you know, giving hope to whatever you believe in, you know, everything from, you know, paganism to Buddhism to Hinduism to, you know, Shintoism to Christianity to Islam to Judaism. It's all based on hope, and then there's some other stuff around it. And I think we're missing that a lot when we do faith-based suicide prevention, is that we're missing, hey, we're either inserting theories. If you're from a clinical psychological background, you're inserting theories where there don't need to be any, right? That silo we were talking about. And faith-based leaders are inserting, you know, and I do it all the time, is inserting theology and doctrine, which can be useful if you're talking to the right people, right? If I'm talking to people, if I'm talking to people who believe suicide is sinful and I'm sitting down to try and change their mind, I'm going to attack it from a scriptural, theological, doctrinal point of view. But if I'm sitting across from someone who's hurting, I'm going to put all that paperwork aside, right? I'm going to, you know, say, hey, that's not, you know, I could pull the scripture out if I need it, if that's something they really want. But in the end, what my goal is, by the end of sitting down with them for however long, is to make them feel more hopeful and more worthy of who they are and what they're doing in life. And if it takes scripture, if it takes doctrine to do that, then so be it. But at the end of the day,
God bless you.
Thank you.
No,
Oh, they're
I
busting.
can't help you with your allergies.
Yeah.
I work hard
But,
enough on my own.
but you know, at the end of the day, I'm sitting down to provide hope, and
Nice point.
I think both psychology and faith have both kind of that's lost in translation of, you know, what we do is, you know, if all we're doing is talking about theory and theology, then what's the hope in that, you know? So I think providing people with worth, like Robert was saying, you know, providing a different way of thinking about things. And it's like, hey, you know, would you apply that to anyone else, right? Would you apply that thinking to, you know, how you know how Jewish thought works is that, you know, how Jewish legalistic argument works is everybody sits around and says, but this rabbi said, and at a certain point you get down to the basics of what does this mean, you know, what does this at a certain point you even get down to like, what does this one word in this one phrase mean, and why does that contextualize everything?
Okay.
But the point I'm making is that we need to break things down to its most basic core of hope, of you are worthy of whatever theology tells you, whatever your theology tells you that you aren't worthy, you are. Whatever psychiatrist who told you, I don't want to see you, you're not worth my time. No, you are worth their time. You know, you are worth people's time. You are worth whatever makes you feel worthy. And I think we're losing that sometimes. Robert,
and that brings me to a thought. You know, I don't believe, I hope anyway, there's that word, that psychiatry, psychology, and mental wellness and faith are mutually exclusive at all. However, if what we've been doing in our what might be not so great attempts to tear down these silos and bring everybody equally to the same table, then no barriers. Money's not a barrier. Past experiences aren't the barrier. Should we be doing something different within the field of suicidology? Should we be should we just throw out everything what we've been doing and you know, I go back to my domestic violence days that I remember someone once saying, remember, Anne-Marie, that, you know, like Humpty Dumpty, you do not want to put the pieces back together again. Those pieces almost killed you. So you have to create a whole new Humpty Dumpty thing there. And that really hit home to me. And I'm wondering if, because our numbers are going up, and the latest report that came out the other day was all about the millennials. And they talked about there were 4 things that they spotlighted, and among those were they are more 18 to 34-year-olds are more likely to be in poverty. They are more likely to have no trusted adult, no connecting adult to turn to. There was no connection to a faith-based community. And they would present typically multiple issues, including in what that really, I have to tell you, having worked in the field, this research was also looking at the genetic and historic connection to substance abuse between grandfather to father and now down to son. So then what are they now teaching their younger generation, their kids? So my question is, I don't want to say have we been doing it all wrong, but rather take a positive of, we know what the pain points are. But so where do we go from there? And you know, and you both don't know me well, but you know me well enough to, from everything that I've got out there, I'm so far outside the box, I can't even find it anymore. You know, it's like way out there. So that's how my brain thinks. It doesn't think theology. It doesn't think theory. It doesn't think research. I look at someone and say, what do they need? Then how can we provide that? Knowing that creates a whole myriad of problems within the field that wants to see the boxes checked off.
Yeah.
You know, so to throw that's a long way around it. Best dream, best hope, way outside the box. What could we start with? What should we be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think taking a more outside the box approach. I mean, right? We know that a lot of treatment is kind of individualized. You know, you bring the person in and things like that. But I do think thinking about people from a biopsychosocial, spiritual, regardless of what you believe that spiritual is, there's a component there, and saying how do we involve communities better, right? I mean, I was thinking about you know, that long piece that a couple months ago came out about Dr. Ursula Whiteside, who threw out a lot of the rules in how she interacted with her clients, right? She would text them GIFs, and how powerful that was of saying, hey, I know the rules are from this time to this time, and I know why they're there, right? I'm a practicing clinician. I understand why they're there. But also we have to say, okay, this is working in some areas. Sometimes it's not. Societally, it's not maybe moving the ball as much as we want it to be. So how do we involve other areas? How can me as your counselor sitting across from you, how can I be working alongside your youth pastor or your school teachers or your best friends or your parent? I mean, how can we involve all these people? And there's 1,000 layers of confidentiality and insurance and HIPAA. And again, I understand all that. Obviously, I'm not doing a lot of outside the box things at the moment, right? But we have to maybe have some of those conversations of what does a bigger version of health and wellness look like? What does a bigger version of giving people hope look like, right? If I say you come to me for counseling for these 50 minutes and then you go to your pastor for some theological counseling and whatnot, and then you go home or maybe you hang out with your friends. Well, okay, if we're again siloing all those off, what is that doing for you? I mean, are those interacting? Can they be working together? I mean, all these ideas of how we keep people alive and healthy and connected socially to other people. I mean, I think we really have to look at things in maybe a more holistic manner. And, you know, you were asking, why is it that, you know, do faith leaders know that there's these conversations happening? You know, before we started, you were asking, and Marsha and I said, kind of, maybe not really. I mean, I don't know how many pastors came to AAS, right? And not just to single that out, you know, but any mental health related conference, not that many. How many mental health people went to theology conferences? Probably none, right? Why is that? If we are all in the business of offering hope and healing and wanting to be a positive force in people's lives, then maybe we need one big conference where we say, okay, send us 4 of your theology guys and 4 of your suicidology guys and 4 of your, I was going to say essential oils guys, but I don't know.
Throw it in. Like, come on.
Maybe we need to be having these conversations. And there are, you know, to give props where they're due. I mean, there's a lot of good work. You know, there's the Action Alliance has the Faith Hope. Shoot, I forgot the name.
That's all right. Marshall, I know what you're talking about. No.
Yeah, there you go. Faith Hope Life. That's there we go. My sincere apologies. You know, there's a couple different. I'm looking at there's some guides put out. Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas co-wrote one with Dr. Tim Doty, I don't know. Right. There's people are putting a couple months ago, they put out the competencies for faith leaders in suicide prevention. Now my question with those is how many faith leaders ended up with those competencies in their hand, right? And that's a both sides thing. How many faith leaders are going on that website, following them on social media, and how much outreach is there on the other side? You know, I think it's not a one side is missing it. I think both sides. How do we, like Marshall said, build that bridge from the bottom up instead of saying, well, we made these resources, nobody's looking at them. Well, okay, then how do we do some more here?
And that reminds me of the Way Forward. When the Action Alliance published the Way Forward in July of 2014, I swear I was the only person that inhaled it because it was so focused on attempt survivors. That is my lifestyle. I'm, you know, Tracy Medeiros is not my biological daughter. I'm a second mom, but, you know, I've been walking with her for 21 years since her last attempt. And there was nothing out there for her. And when we did the documentary, A Voice at the Table, Desiree, Kara Anna Craig Millett and Tracy all said, without ever talking to each other, all said the same thing. There was no peer-to-peer support for us. So when the Way Forward came out and said, we recommend that you do this, this, and this, I kept waiting for this national political will to jump on it, and it's never happened. And so that's it. So who read it? You know? And so we need to put our collective creative heads together and say, then how can we do, I won't say a better job, because most of us have been trying to do that, but how do we get that out? I think, unfortunately, and Marsh, you were down in DC. I really believe our best hope, and that really scares me, is political will. Someone has to finally say enough is enough. And yes, we have the Garrett Lee Smith State and Tribal Grant because of what happened to Senator Smith and losing his son Garrett. But that's a teeny tiny piece when you look at all that's happened to go with there. Marsh, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I want you both starting to think about your final thoughts. Do you realize the time has gone?
Yeah.
So, Marsh, any of the stuff that we just talked about, or anything else?
I mean, I think one of the last things I talked about in my presentation for my capstone and my paper itself is the solutions, potential solutions to prevention problems in the church. And I say prevention problems, but really it's intervention, prevention, and postvention.
Gotcha.
I think the church has done terrible at all of it over the centuries. It's just not been good in any way in all regards. As I was actually writing this paper that semester, and I put it out on the listserv, and it went pretty viral to the point where the BBC News was talking about it, is that a priest in Detroit was doing a suicide funeral. He had his he had his eulogy set, and he went completely off script. Started saying a lot of horrible, hurtful things, to the point where the father of the boy whose funeral this was said, "Enough is enough, Father," and moved outside and didn't invite him to the graveside service. And the bishop was perfectly okay with them doing that. The bishop gave the guy a slap on the wrists. He's not going to be doing funerals for a while, and not to get too heated about it, but that's not enough. But anyways,
I thought that was one of the most obnoxious things I'd ever seen in a long time.
My
jaw dropped. My jaw dropped.
I wanted him defrocked, because that's just not how you do things. But I think, the brighter side of that is, that people have done a lot of really hard work and really good work about trainings, books. If I know anything about ministers, it's that we all read too many books, about too many. There's a book about everything, and we'll read it.
Yep.
So there's books, Jim Clemens, doing his work, offering support, just frankly, just being there is really great work. And that's something a lot of people don't really know enough about, is sitting down and going, what can I do? Not offering platitudes. When I went to the workshop, the AAS workshop, in Denver, Karen Mason talked about not offering platitudes, to avoid them. She actually quoted the book of Proverbs, like vinegar on a wound is one who sings songs to a heavy heart. You don't try and sugarcoat it. Someone just lost someone. They lost someone to suicide. One, don't sit there and condemn the person who died, and two, know how to comfort. Know how to do good pastoral care. I will argue till I'm blue in the face that it's not enough that every seminary I've ever looked at has the requirement of one pastoral care class, and that's it. One pastoral care class and one CPE class. Clinical pastoral education, where you do either hospital chaplaincy or prison chaplaincy. That's one requirement. That's all you have to do. You can do more, and I fully plan on it, but you don't have to. And I think that's a big problem, that it's not on any one school. It's just that's the way it's always been. So why should we do anything else? And I think overall, I think it's just about understanding that there is, for clergy, for ministers, for youth ministers, for whatever you are in your religious institution, that there are materials out there to help you help others. We've got, I could, if I wanted to find a commentary on the book of Luke, I'm sure I would get 1,000 results. Same goes for books on ministry and suicide prevention or pastoral care and suicide prevention, but nobody's reading them. I think to circle it all the way back around to how we talked about at the beginning, just showing people that, not only inviting people to the table, showing them there's a table at all to be invited to.
Gotcha.
It's super, super important, because otherwise you invite them to the table and if they don't know about it, they're confused.
Yep. I get that.
Out in the blue and not really sure if they should. And it's like, oh, well, that's that? Scary.
Yeah,
that's the unknown. I don't like that. But.
Well, I deal with the unknown. Okay, gentlemen. First, I'm going to say thank you for being here.
Thank you.
But what's your last? You each got about a minute. What's your takeaway? What would you want people? Because I know from our last 6 months, we're going to have probably 10 times more people view this in the next week than we're sitting with us tonight.
Yeah.
And I'm one of those people that doesn't care. I don't worry about numbers. I just know that the information can go out there. And I will be sharing these throughout the summer, by the way. I'll be sharing these out there. So what would you want everybody to take away about tonight's comments, Robert?
Yeah, I would say, everybody's role is important. So whether that means you recognizing as a faith leader or something like that your role is important, or if you're in the mental health field saying, oh, okay, their role also is important. I think everybody's role is important. Everybody plays a part in this. And also, I think it doesn't have to be super scary, right? I mean, obviously you go into a room and you say, let's talk about suicide, and the air goes out, right? Because everyone says, oh my God, that's terrifying. But it doesn't have to be scary. There are, like Marshall was talking about, resources to read, and it's not about saying the perfect thing. It's about knowing kind of how to sit in that moment. There's, I know QPR has a QPR online training that's just for clergy. I mean, there's assist training. There's all sorts of things like that. There's books, right, that we have some references for, but it doesn't have to be scary from either side. It's not super scary to go into a church and do a suicide prevention training or to start those conversations. But also, if you're on the faith side, it doesn't have to be scary to say, hey, I'm willing to step into my role in that,
Thank you. Marsh.
We had similar ideas, Robert, about our final thought.
I'm not surprised.
I think it's really important that we understand that from both sides, this is the unknown. This bridge is unknown to us. For psychologists, it's, really scary to get into religion, because if my client's religious and I don't know enough about that tradition, what kind of water am I getting into, right? And from a faith-based perspective, if I don't know about psychology, do I just pawn them off on somebody? Do I try and help them myself? Am I liable if I try and help them myself and it doesn't work out? And I think what we both have to understand is, especially in the world of faith-based care, is that we always work in the unknown. We've always worked in the unknown since the beginning of any religion. That's how religion works, is working with the stuff we don't understand quite. We don't quite get it, but because of our religion, that's how we get it. And I think, I preached on that this morning. That's why it's in my head, is that, when we kind of wander into the unknown, that's when the best things happen. That's when the most work happens. That's when the best, the best care happens, the best knowledge happens, is both wandering into the unknown of this bridge between faith and mental health and going, all right, let's do this. I think that's the most solid way we can do it, is just venture into the unknown, and with your background in mind, venture into the unknown and make it the known.
Cool beans. Gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been a very, very interesting conversation. And I know more people will be viewing this video, and I thank you for taking time out on a Sunday night.
Yeah.
I recognize that that's not the best time for everybody. However, April locked it in to Sunday nights, so there we are. So thank you both again. Have a wonderful. I hope somewhere in there there's a holiday in this week for you guys. I have Thursday off. It's about it. But that's
I have
okay.
Wednesday.
But I am done. No, see, I am celebrating because I am free. I have total independence for 7 days because all of my FY19 budgets have been balanced to the nth degree. My year-end reports are in draft form. Those don't even have to be until the 15th. And my June reports, because I manage 4 different contracts, they're done. I mean, I almost didn't know what to do with myself this afternoon. I went, oh, I don't have to do that. Right. It's all done. It's all done. So I'm just going to enjoy the week. So
there you go. That's awesome.
There we go.
Yep. All right, gentlemen, take care. Thank you.
All right. You
Thank
too.
you.
Thank you.